maybe after midnight I'll cut you off. All right? Now, without further ado, let me introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Khaldoun Sweis. Dr. Sweis is a chair and associate professor of philosophy at Olive Harvey College and serves as a tutor in philosophy with Oxford University in England. He has an MA degree from Trinity International University in Christian thought with an emphasis in philosophy of religion. His specialty is in philosophy of mind, which is the subject of his doctoral work at the University of Hull, where he earned his PhD in philosophy of mind in the UK. His experience entails teaching philosophy for over a decade, as well as speaking at conferences both nationally and abroad in such places as Hong Kong, Romania, Australia, and England. Dr. Sweis is the founder of the Socratic Project, which hosts debates and discussions on critical issues of our time and addresses the ultimate questions of life. He's also the author of 2 books, Debating Christian Theism, which was co-edited with Chad Meister and J.P. Moreland, as well as Christian Apologetics, an anthology of primary sources, which was co-edited again with Chad Meister. And Dr. Sweis is also privileged to be married to Luciana and is the father of 2 precious little children, as he describes them, Anna Katerina and Daniel Zacharias. So with no further ado, can we please welcome up Dr. Khaldoun Sweis.
Well, good evening. You don't believe in miracles, you believe an ADHD kid. Got that kind of bio? You start believing it after you read that. It's amazing what you can do, step by step, with the hand of God behind you. Thank you all for coming out. It's a privilege to be here. My only biological son died on November 20, 2006. His lungs were biologically malfunctioning. No medical technology on earth, and we went to everywhere we could save him. He died in my arms. The shadow of death descended upon us. It wrapped its talons and its bat-like wings around our souls. All happiness, peace, and joy evaporated from my life when he was gone. I thought I would never see him again. I fell into the blackest abyss in my life. And where was God? Where was God? My experience is not unique by any stretch of the imagination. This is the experience of many millions of people throughout the channels of human history. My wrestling match with God ended in my loss, terrible loss, of course, what a shocking surprise. But it was the only way I found I could win. The experience changed me forever. This image that you see behind me is the image called The Vulture and the Little Girl. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning portrait taken in the New York Times on March 26, 1993. The photographer, Kevin Carter, was working with the United Nations at a point in Sudan, South Sudan, where they had set up a food pantry. People were not allowed, the soldiers were not allowed to cross a certain line, no matter what. And across that line, they saw this little girl trying to get some food. And behind her kept crawling this vulture. The vulture would not leave her. The vulture was waiting for her to die. The picture made its rounds all over the world. And he got a lot of fame out of it. But something tragic happened approximately 1 year later to Carter. The pain of that little girl, the vulture hunting her, and the vitriol he received from his fellow journalists and people around the world, why didn't you save that little girl? Haunted him so much that he took his life. He committed suicide. I am from the country of Jordan, which is right next to Syria, where we have one of the largest refugee crises in the history of the world. Approximately 50 million people worldwide have been displaced and are considered refugees. 13 million from Syria alone, from that terrible civil war. In that civil war, you'll see the picture here. This is Alan Kurdi. Alan Kurdi drowned in the Mediterranean Sea as his parents tried to get over to find hope in Europe. That picture opened up the door for many refugees throughout Europe because of his death. Many of us ask, where is God? Matter of fact, that question is ancient. The ancient scriptures declare it as well. The psalmist cries out in the Hebrew Bible, "But, O Lord, I cry to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me?" So the problem of evil is a universal problem. It's a problem everyone struggles with in one form or another. One way or another, you will deal with it if you live long enough. And we are naive, ladies and gentlemen, if we believe. We are naive if we believe we can solve the most difficult, perplexing problem in human history by pointing to some snake in a garden, or dropping 26,171 bombs on people. This is what the United States did just last year on ISIS, and saying they are the problem. When I address people like members of the United Nations, or when I address businesses and corporations, which I speak to on a periodic basis, corporations like you see behind me, one of the main points we make is take responsibility for your own. Instead of saying he's the bad guy, or the evil's over there, or they're evil, take it yourself. Take responsibility for it. If you don't own it, you're not being what's called an adult. It's a kindergarten lesson. We need to take responsibility for the evils in the world because they are done by our fellow members of the human race. Every single man, woman, and child in human history has been touched by the parasite of evil, except for one. I'll talk about him later. I recommend you take a look at the book of Genesis, one of the most profound pieces of literature in all of human history, where it talks about the story of that problem. Has anybody read the book of Genesis?
Yes.
Wonderful. If you haven't, you're missing out. Take a look. It's a wonderful piece of literature. Transforming, to say the least. This, what you see before you, is what's called an ant mill. An ant mill is a phenomenal phenomenon in nature. What happens is, ants are creatures that follow after the ant before them. And when they have run out of their senses and not know where they're going, they continue following that ant. But what happens when the ant, the lead ant, doesn't know where it's going? It goes in a circle. And all the thousands of other ants do the same. They continue the process until they're completely exhausted and starved to death. Then you end up with a pit of ants in the middle, dead. It's a phenomenon in nature. What's interesting about this is that it speaks to our sociological, secular worldview that we're in today. We're following after the next spiritual fad, trying to find the leader, and we end up going in circles. Rather than finding spiritual salvation, we find spiritual starvation. How can we find a leader? How can we find a goal, a signpost that'll lead us out of this mess? What I've done here is listed 6 signposts to help us find a clue to help us understand, not necessarily solve the problem of evil. So I'm going to be giving you 6 signposts to help us point that out. The first signpost is to understand what exactly is the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is ancient, as I mentioned, but some people have been very articulate in putting it down. Specifically, members, I'll throw out some names for you. You may know these big guns. David Hume, Epicurus, J.L. Mackie, and today, the leading atheist of the world, Richard Dawkins. They would lay the problem down at the very throne of God himself. It's not our fault, it's his. After all, this is happening on his watch, right? And the problem comes down as a logical problem of evil, and it's articulated in this fashion. If God is all-powerful, what we call omnipotent, then he could stop all evil instantly. Globally is what I have up there. If God is all-knowing, he knows about it before it even happened. And he knows definitely the resources of how to do it. If God is all-good, omnibeneficent, then he would want to eliminate evil. After all, any loving father would want to do that to their children, now would he not? But evil remains. Therefore, the inescapable conclusion that we have to reach is that there is no God. There are different nuances of the problem, of course. This problem has, for the most part, been solved philosophically. Now hear me clearly here. It's been solved philosophically, not existentially or experientially, but philosophically or logically. Hear me out. According to the majority of philosophers, like St. Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and most recent ones, Richard Swinburne and the most famous Alvin Plantinga, have put together a response called the free will defense. I recommend you look into that. The free will defense basically says, if God, in his infinite wisdom, decided to create free creatures, it would be impossible, even for the power of omnipotence, to make them follow him. Otherwise, they wouldn't be free. That's like making square circles, or married bachelors, although there's a few who may think they are. God, in his infinite wisdom, decided the chance was worth it. I will make beings who can say no to me. Why? Because he's after something greater than that. He's after love. And love requires choice. When I proposed to my precious wife, I didn't tell her, would you marry me? By the way, your parents are locked up in a basement somewhere ready to be executed on my command if you don't say yes. What do you say? What kind of, that's coercion. That's not love. She has to have the option to say love, to say yes, and the option to say no. And that is what God opens. So therefore, the free will defense opens up the door for that. As long as God is able to have a reason beyond us for the evil, and we don't have to understand it, as long as it's even logically possible, then the free will defense overcomes the logical argument. And St. Thomas Aquinas put it this way in his Summa Theologica, another book you should check out. Summa Theologica. Sounds kind of fancy, but it is actually. Since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his universe, unless his omnipotence and his goodness were such as to bring out good even out of the most horrendous of evils. And if it's possible, then it's logical, and the argument dissolves. Again, logically. C.S. Lewis is a wonderful author, and he said the following: free will, though it makes evil possible, makes possible any love or goodness worth having. You need to have it, and that is what free will allows the horrendous evils that we have. Let's go to signpost number 2. Let's define evil. What on earth do we mean when we say evil? I don't mean Dr. Evil and the little evil guy. I'm talking about real evil. How on earth do we even define it? How do we even get a term that is universal? Well, evil itself is not easy to define, but it is definable. Because one of the objections labeled against God is that since he created everything, and evil is a thing, then it follows logically that God created evil. I'll deal with that. Well, let's take a step back. Evil is not a thing. Actually, evil is a lack of a thing. In philosophical terminology, it's lacking ontological status, lacking ontological substance. And ontology is a branch of philosophy that deals with being. What does it mean for something to be? And evil itself is the negation of good. It can't exist without it. It's like a parasite that sucks off the good. It can't exist without it on its own. Augustine would have argued that well, that evil is a privation of the good. So, if Rafe were to shut all these lights off, we would have darkness. And all darkness would be is the absence of light. And that is a form of what evil is. It's the absence of good. Or to put it theologically, it's the absence of God. And the further we move away from the center of our universe, the star, what we call the soul, the darker and colder it gets. And ladies and gentlemen, the further away we move from the source of life, God, the darker and colder it gets spiritually. And that's evil for you. And Augustine would have put it in the way I just put forward there. So it's a privation of good. It's a negation of it. It doesn't have substance in itself. That's why you can have an absolute good, but you cannot have an absolute evil. Let's go to signpost number 3. Actually, I want to back up a little bit before I move into this, just to bring this point home. The absence of evil is not just a theoretical term, it's a powerful existential one too. It was the first Thanksgiving after my father died. And I remember we sat around the table. It was the first time in my life I saw his chair was empty. And his absence was more powerful at that time than his presence. And if you are a driver in Chicago, you'll go over something called a pothole. A pothole is a negation of the road. And it can cause your tire to explode. Evil is very much real. Contrary to what my Eastern friends would have said, evil is an illusion. It's Maya, as some of the Hindu mystics would have said. But even a Hindu mystic will get out of the way when somebody's trying to shoot him, or attack him, or a lion is running. It's very easy to pontificate about things and write about them. But when you try to live it, that's when your theory becomes reality. So, signpost number 3. Evil leads logically to God, not away from God. Many would postulate that I have left my faith because I have suffered this excruciating pain. And I understand that, I feel with that. But listen to the words of Bertrand Russell. Russell was known as one of the most famous atheists in all of history. Great mathematician at Oxford University. And here's what he said. Man is a product of causes which have no provision of the end from which they are achieved. His origins, his growth, his hopes and his fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcomes of accidental collocations of atoms that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. And all labors of ages, all the devotions, all the inspirations, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to the extinction and the vast death of the solar system. Only with the scaffolding of these truths, only in the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. This is coming from the atheistic worldview of Bertrand Russell. And he is not alone. One of the most prolific atheists of the day, as I mentioned him earlier, is Richard Dawkins. Dawkins says something similar, because he argues that the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we would expect if at bottom there is no design, no purpose, no good, no evil, nothing but pitiless indifference. Now, you may be an atheistic background and say, I disagree with them, I don't believe that. Granted. Well, hear me out here. Atheists, by definition, deny the absolute. It's the absolute negation of the absolute. And when you remove God, as Nietzsche said, you also remove all moral absolutes within. So then, if there are no moral absolutes, by what standard are you judging God with? If there is no standard. So it contradicts itself. On one hand, you're judging, and on one hand, you don't believe there's a judgment to judge with, other than your own preconceived opinions. So it's an interesting paradox that we have on that end. So atheism doesn't really solve the problem. It creates a problem within atheism itself because there is no evil to deal with. But my atheist friends have no problem making millions of dollars on New York Times best-selling books, attacking God for his lack of action in evil. It's fascinating. When you look at things like rape, murder, war, child abuse, greed, human brutality, kidnapping, bullying, ridiculing, slavery, the refusal to share food, if you don't call those evil, I don't know what it is. Just last week, close to where I was born, a little girl was released into a Damascus police station. She was 7 years old. She had strapped on her a suicide bomb vest and blew up in the station. Again, if that's not evil, I don't know what is. We are left now with a denial of the absolute, and what do we have in its place? What are we replacing God with? What are we going to put there? And Nietzsche said, when you have removed God, you are going to end up with the bloodiest century in the history of the world. And Friedrich Nietzsche said that at the tail end of the 19th century. And ladies and gentlemen, the 20th and 21st centuries are becoming that. We have killed more people these centuries than all the others combined. Of course, that has something to do with WMDs and weapons of mass destruction. But nevertheless, the lesson stands. So Lewis, back to him again, would have said the following: if my argument against God was that the world was cruel and unjust, how did I get this idea of cruel and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe to when I called it unjust? What was the standard? And that led him to start seeking God rather than moving away. Signpost number 4. Are you with me? Signpost number 4. When my son died, it was very difficult for me to enjoy anything, let alone orange juice or even my daily routines, because everything was focused on that and the depth of the pain was overwhelming. However, listen to this, because this is profound news for me. Not all evil is suffering. And not all suffering is evil. A distinction needs to be made. Sometimes suffering is good for us. Ask any Olympic athlete how much they suffered to get that medal. Most of them did not flow right into it. I mean, none of them did. Listen to this. The sky must break to produce the rain. The rain must break the ground to produce the rivers. The rivers must break the land to produce the plants. The plant vegetation produces fruit. The fruit breaks down to produce minerals within our very bodies. And those break down to give us nutrition. The breaking down process is in nature. It's in the seasons of the summer, and when they go into spring and winter and death and rebirth. It's in everywhere. And if you've known anybody who's somebody, they've suffered. I'm writing a book on the great ones. Alexander the Great, Solzhenitsyn, even modern day Steve Jobs. And guys, I'm telling you the truth, every single one of them had to overcome overwhelming odds. They had to suffer to become the person they were. In the crucible of suffering is where your character is formed. And I can probably ask a lot of you who've been through a lot, that many of you would not trade it because it made you who you are. It was in the crucible of that your character was formed. And the things that you don't need were kind of wiped away. Now I understand that sometimes suffering does not make good people. I mean, Nietzsche said it. He said that doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. However, sometimes what doesn't kill you makes you more cruel. And that's actually a scene from the recent Batman vs. Superman film. It's what makes good men cruel is one of the scenes in there. Fascinating, isn't it? Either way, it's a choice that you have to make. It's a choice we individually make. Matter of fact, Plato said it well through Socrates, the other way around. No evil can befall a good man, is what it says in the Republic. What are you talking about, Socrates? Have you even got out of your house? Of course evil happens to good people. Hold on. Evil happens to your bodies. It only happens to your soul or you if you let it. There are people in the prisons and the gulags who have more freedom inside than some of the people walking around the streets. Because they're free in and within. Has anybody seen the famous painting of Leonardo da Vinci? Jesus in the Last Supper? Very famous, a powerful one. In there, what you have is the scene called the Last Supper, where Jesus is taking the bread, and then he says something. He says, "This is a symbol of my body. This is my body, which is broken for you." In that brokenness, we find our wholeness. In his brokenness, we find our fullness. And it's echoed even in our own lives. From our brokenness, we find fullness. Full fullness is found in the one who brings it. And that's where he comes in. So I have 2 hobbits, 2 little ones, 6 and 7. I'm going to talk about how that happened too after my son in a little bit. But what we do is we read. Well, they read to me, and sometimes the other way around. And this story, The Velveteen Rabbit, a classic. Has anybody ever picked it up? Good stuff. Not necessarily Augustine's, but nevertheless, it works. The rabbit asks, what is real? He's laying beside the nursery next to the skin horse. Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and stick out handle? Real isn't how you're made, said the skin horse. It's a thing that happens to you when a child loves you for a long time, not just to play with, but really loves you. Then you become real. Does it hurt? Asked the rabbit. Sometimes, said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. When you're real, you don't mind being hurt. Does it happen all at once, like being wound up? He's asked, or bit by bit. It doesn't happen all at once, said the skin horse. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easy, or have sharp edges, or have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you're real, your eyes drop out and you get loose in the joints and become very shabby. These things don't matter though at all, because once you're real, you can't be ugly, except to those who don't understand. I suppose you are real? Asked the rabbit. Then he wished he had not said it, for the skin horse may be sensitive, but the skin horse only smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, suffering makes us more real than any other thing we can go through. And I think it's one of the ways and means of God. R.C. Sproul said it the best. Evil is not good, but it is good that there is evil. Ladies and gentlemen, if you felt the sharp pain of evil or suffering upon your soul, you know that it does deal a pain that sometimes cannot be healed. But you just learn to deal with it. And then you change through it. If you let it. If you let the divine hand move in there. So, I'm at 5. The purpose of life. What is the purpose of life? And that's a question we ask in philosophy classes and roll our eyes by the time somebody finishes it. But it's an important question. No business can operate unless they know the purpose of the business. And I talked to my members in the business environment, business community. If you don't have a goal that's worth fighting for to the end, then is it even worth starting the business for? Is it worth it? What is the goal that you're going after? Something other than the bottom line. What is your goal? Do you have one? One of my colleagues, one of my mentors actually, Ken Davis, said it well. If we shoot for nothing in life, we will hit it every time. And many of us are just shooting all over the place and wondering why we're not getting anywhere. And ladies and gentlemen, we have sadly bought into the notion that God is some kind of cosmic sugar daddy who's obligated to give us everything and anything we want. Our cat will never die. Our grandmother will never get sick. Your spouse will always love you. You'll never get an F on any paper. Your child will always be on the honor roll and say, yes ma'am, yes sir. And the only thing you have to agonize about is what to watch next on Netflix. How foolish. How adolescent of us. How naive and gullible. Life is not genuine unless you go through that crucible. And that's where you find meaning and purpose, by the way. Rather than embracing what philosophers have called moralistic therapeutic deism. You can ask me about that in Q&A. Let's make this real. One of my friends, George Knoop, from the Moody Memorial Church, just a few miles north, after July 12, 2010, where a magnitude earthquake of 7 on the Richter scale hit Haiti, approximately 300,000 people were killed and over 1 million displaced. What did George do? George felt a call upon his life from the divine to sell everything he owned and go to Haiti. And he did. He went to Haiti. And he lived there for 4 years, helping the most distraught and downtrodden people on earth in that particular time because of the earthquake. Now, 4 years later, somebody went into the hut where George was and stabbed him multiple times. George was found dead. That's my friend, George. If atheism is true, if there is nothing but life is here, then George wasted his time. It was a waste. But if there is a divine hand behind this, then life has meaning. And if life has meaning, then his suffering has meaning too. And so was his death. And I am not worthy to touch the shoes that George wore. Has anybody read the world-class best-selling book, The Purpose-Driven Life? It was actually the bestseller a number of years ago, worldwide. In it, Rick Warren says this line. It's actually one of the first lines in the book. It's not about you. It's not about you. And you won't find meaning if you keep thinking it's about you. Matter of fact, you know what we do with people in prison when they break the law? We put them in isolation, right? That's what prison is. But what if they break the law in prison? What do we do with them? What's it called? The hole. That's right. There's another name for it.
Solitary confinement.
Solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is where you have to face, guess who? Yourself. It's a type of hell when you're constantly looking at yourself. That's why people who are depressed are constantly told, don't stay there, get out, talk to other people. You're not made to be alone. And did you know something profound? God, in Christian tradition, is never alone because he's a community of a trinity from eternity. He's three in one. It's a profound thought that can generate a lot of interesting discussion. Has anybody seen the show? The Walking Dead is now in its 7th season. What is interesting about this apocalyptic series is not that the zombies are riding the earth and people are trying to survive. It's not even interesting that there's wonderful, incredible special effects. What's interesting is that the Walking Dead are us. How will we survive when all hell breaks loose around us? What will we do to each other? And that show brings that out in profound ways. So it makes it very interesting. However, the show is losing approximately 2 million viewers a week. Why? It's because it's moving from purpose to purposelessness. It's moving from overcoming obstacles to becoming overcome by the obstacles. It's moving to what is called philosophically nihilism. Life has no meaning, just deal with it. That's what the show has been embracing lately. And that has turned people off. Because each and every one of us seeks meaning in one way or another. And when you're not presenting that as an artist, the heart's deepest longing, you end up losing people. And that's what's happening to that show. Anyway, let's go to signpost number 6, and this is where I'll start slowly landing the plane. The cross. I can't avoid that. I don't know and understand why God, in his infinite wisdom, let my son die, or let many other children starve throughout history. But there are some clues. Now the problem with this is, how can we nail God down like some kind of computer program and figure out exactly why he's doing something? I mean, he's the infinite one if he exists, right? How can we possibly nail God down? Well, if you caught it. But we did. We did nail God down. Matter of fact, when God showed up, that's exactly what we did on the Roman cross. His name was Emmanuel, Jesus of Nazareth. And I'm convinced that the problem of evil is not an answer. It's something more. I'm convinced that the answer to the problem of evil is much more than an answer, for I don't think we can even grasp the answer if we can even have it. If anybody has read one of the oldest books in history called the Book of Job, Job argues with God back to back over 40 chapters and demanding an answer for the evil that's happened to him. And at the end, God shows up, but he doesn't one time give Job a direct answer. And I think it's because we can't handle it. And something else. He gave Job something he needed more than an answer. He gave him himself. God gave Job something he needed more than anything, a relationship. That's what we all need more than anything. And then with the advent and the incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth, God becomes one of us. And he walks among us. And my Muslim friends will disagree with that. But the Quran extols Jesus more than Muhammad. Read it. It does in Surah 3 specifically. Just a couple weeks ago, my aunt, actually it was more than a couple weeks ago, she lost her mother and her brother in the same week. Very difficult for her. And she kept asking, why? Why? And I took her hand in tears and said, what if the question we're asking is not that? What if there's a deeper question we need to ask? What if we're looking for something more than just that answer? We're looking for, how does the divine just sit up there in his throne and just watch us? I recommend the book Making Sense Out of Suffering by Peter Kreeft, Boston philosophy professor in my profession. And he said the following: if that there is not God, but only a good man, then God is not off the hook on the cross in our suffering. If God is not off the hook, then God is not, if God is not on the hook, then God is not off the hook. How could he sit there in heaven and ignore our tears? There is, as we saw, one good reason for disbelieving in God: evil. And God himself has answered the objection, not in words, but in deeds, as Jesus is the tears of God. And Edward Chalito said the following: not a God has wounds, but thou alone. When Enoch died, my son, I grew in my spirit more than I've ever grown before as a man. My wife could say similar things. And in that crucible of the suffering, we were going through the country of Moldova, one of the poorest countries in all Eastern Europe, where high rates of trafficking are there. And we went there and we did something called adoption. And those are the two I mentioned earlier. And we got them. It took a while. They're there. Ana Katarina and Daniel. They're from that orphanage over there. They have been an incredible source of joy for us. Out of the ashes and the pain of death of Enoch, from the phoenix rose these two. And God can do that for each one of us, if you just let him. He's a gentleman who will not impose himself. Robert Hamilton said the following: I walked a mile with pleasure, and she chatted all the way, but left me none the wiser for all she had to say. I walked a mile with sorrow, and not a word said she, but all the things I learned from her when sorrow walked with me. It's been 10 years, 2 months, and 6 days since he's been gone. I have grown. The pain is not easier, but I've learned to enjoy life and enjoy the God that one day I may not go to him. He may not come to me, but I will go to him, as echoed in David. And in conclusion, going back to that earlier argument, that's Anna, by the way, my daughter. She's the one in the middle doing this. She was in the Joffrey Ballet in downtown just a few weeks ago, which was playing the Nutcracker. She was a real joy jumping up and down on the stage there. She was one of the snowflakes. Let's go back to the problem of evil. Now, this is similar to what you saw earlier, but I've added this conclusion. Yes, God is all good, all-knowing, all-powerful. He could have done everything. Did he? Well, here's what he has done. God has taken the agony of evil himself on the cross. He didn't let somebody else do it, he did it himself. So he feels our pain in a more profound way than anybody can, for he is infinite. He has confronted evil by making people, his own people, which my friend Ray earlier referred to as the church, to fight it. And by the way, the church has been foundational in human history as the major source for humanitarian help in the history of the world. More orphanages, more hospitals, more humanitarian relief organizations have been done and opened up by Christians than any other group in the history of the world. And colleges and universities as well. You doubt me, look it up yourself. God's people have done more good for the world than any others. And we do have our shame for some of the things we've done as well. We have to own up for those. He will return personally to set things right and make sense of inexplainable horrors for each one of us. And I conclude with this story. There was a village in Africa where there was a fire that broke out among the tents. And the villagers tried to scamper for help and get out of the way. One particular family could not get out, for the flames had engulfed their tent. And the elders and the people and the soldiers could not get in there to get the family out. Suddenly, a figure runs off from the forest, into the flames, into the home, and carries out the newborn baby, puts him down, and disappears in the shadows. The next day, after everything has died down and they buried their dead and paid their respects, the elders got together and said, this must be a miracle child, he survived. And they began to debate among themselves who would take care of this child. The elders said, we should, for we are the wisest. The wealthiest said, no, we should, for we have the most wealth, etc. They went back and forth. And then a young man came out and said, no, I have a right to take care of this child. And they said, who do you think you are? He showed him his hands. He had burns on his hands, and the elders shut their mouths. For he had earned the right to take care of that child, for he suffered to get him. Nobody else did. And I'm saying this as a philosophy professor and as a Christian. If you study all the religions of the world, Jesus himself suffered in ways that are beyond the scope of the other great religious leaders. And I'm not downplaying them. I think they're like stars in the night. They bring light to a lot of us. But Jesus is like the sun, because he does more than just bring light. He brings life. In his death, there's life. It's more profound than that, but only he has earned the right to do that, because he has suffered. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My first question is going to be, where do I sign up for your classes? I want to thank you for being here. We're now going to move to the second phase of tonight. And like we said, Think is all about having a conversation. We don't want this to be a one-way conversation. We need it to be both ways. There's a lot of folks in here. There's going to be two ways you can ask a question. Let me give some ground rules for us. The ground rules are this. If you come up to the mic to ask a question, we ask that you just ask your question. Let's try to refrain from follow-up questions afterwards, after the response is given. The time for follow-up questions and kind of ongoing back and forth debate will be afterwards in the coffee shop. So we'd love to have that. So if you approach the microphone, please keep it to one question. Again, there's two ways. We would love to have